Hey guys, it's Sarah from Just My Typewriter, and it's time for another installment of Typewriter 202. Now in this series we are covering some of the additional things you might learn as you get into typewriters and into typewriter repair and typewriter use. In Typewriter 101 we talked about things like basic maintenance, where to get ribbons, but one of the questions I get asked by people who already own typewriters is what kind of typewriter paper do you use? Now, you can get lots of types of paper into a typical typewriter, and I personally use traditional printer paper in most of my typewriters, but I know this is something that really can impact how a typewriter is used and the overall visual effect of typing on paper. So today we're going to dive into a little bit behind the history of paper and the types of paper that are going to work best for your typewriter. Now, there are two main things that can really impact how ink is accepted into paper in your typewriter. The first is composition and the second is size. Now, composition can include things like the weight of the paper, the texture, the brightness of the paper, the materials that it's made out of. And I don't know any of this stuff, so I decided to talk to an expert. So today I'm interviewing Amber from A Favorite Designs in Chicago, Illinois, who runs a printing press, and she's going to tell us all about the different types of paper and the composition that goes into making really great paper.
I'm Amber Favorite, and my business is A Favorite Design. I am a graphic designer turned letterpress printer. And I basically design and letterpress print thousands and thousands of greeting cards every year that I sell wholesale, nationwide, and retail in my own storefront and online as well. Letterpress printing is pretty fascinating because you can make adjustments to where you can print on something as thin as what would be called onion skin. It's a very thin, fine paper. And you can basically, you have to build up packing so that it's high enough to make the impression on the paper. You can also back off the platen and print on heavy, heavy stock. Even coaster paper or museum board, you can actually run through the printing press. It's pretty fascinating how versatile it is.
And what's your favorite type of paper to print on? Do you have a preference?
We print almost exclusively on 100-pound cover stock, which is very thick. And then when we do business cards, we have printed up to like 220-pound, which is really substantial.
So that kind of leads into the question of, I see pound labeled on a lot of papers when I them. What does that measure? What does that mean when you've got different pound weights to your paper?
Yeah, so it's kind of an old school process and standard. When they first started making paper, they decided on standard size sheets. So text weight, for example, the standard parent size sheet is 25 by 38. And they will measure 500 sheets of that parent size sheet, and that's how you get the poundage. The only kind of weird thing is cover stock. The parent size sheets are smaller. So they're 20 by 26. So you're kind of comparing two completely different sized piles of paper, which can lead to some confusion with cover stock versus text weight.
As a consumer, the higher that pound weight, the thicker the paper or the heavier the paper?
Correct. So, if you're writing a letter or typing, you might choose something that's 28-pound text weight or 32-pound text weight. But if you notice you get higher into cover weight, even a light cover weight, like 60-pound or 80-pound, it might crease in your typewriter on the roller as you're bringing it through because the grain of the paper and the weight of the paper, typewriters are really made more for lighter text weight.
So the difference between text weight and cover stock then is like how heavy they are and the measurements there. What's text weight made for specifically?
So text weight, if you think back when printing began, it was used for the inside of booklets and books and basically to get the word out, right? Printing in general was to share a message. And then cover weight is more for posters, like playbills, posters and things. It was also used for covers on booklets to keep them a little more sturdy so they wouldn't get dinged up or damaged.
One thing with color too, which is interesting, is we get into like the brightness. That's another thing I see a lot on paper. Like when you're buying it on Amazon, it says, 94 brightness or whatever. How is that measured, and how might that impact the look of what you're using the paper for?
So brightness is based on the reflection of blue, blue light hitting a sheet. So it runs from 0 to 100, although I've never seen 100 brightness on anything. And it's made mostly for people who are doing offset printing or copies or things where you want like photographs to really pop or graphics to really pop. Personally, I'm kind of a vintage lover. So I prefer more accru colors and tones, and I don't really stick to the stark white necessarily. I think though, mostly for the human eye, we can't determine the difference between like 94 and 96. Like it's pretty close, but 94 and 98, you can probably notice.
When I thought brightness, I was thinking about how thick it was, and if you put a light behind it, if you could see through it, but that would be probably more related to weight.
Yes.
Okay.
But there's also finishes that it's basically called opacity of a paper. So if you think of opacity, that means opaqueness of a sheet. So a lot of the thinner papers let a lot of light in. You can also purchase paper like it's called vellum. And it is translucent almost, very smooth, not any tooth or anything in it. But it's really great for if you're doing like, they would call it a fly sheet on a booklet, so that maybe you have a dedication and then there's an image behind it and it shows through, something like that.
I've heard you mention the word tooth a couple times. What does that mean with paper?
A lot of papers have a texture on it. For example, like linen paper has a pattern that has been most likely rolled onto the paper after it's been made. So it creates a texture. Tooth on a sheet, typically, if you touch a sheet of paper, you can almost feel with your fingers the texture of the sheet. And so the cover stock usually has more of a texture. Uncoated paper has a texture. Coated stock is very smooth, will not have a tooth.
So it seems like there's a lot that goes into determining the texture of the paper, and also, just what it feels like between the coating and the tooth and the materials that go into making that paper. And that can all impact how you use it then as a printer or a typewriter user.
That's right. In my storefront, I physically have vintage sheets of paper that we sell for people to type on or create art with. And they're all old letterhead of different businesses. And the most popular ones we have are linen sheets. And they typically have a beautiful watermark in the paper. And, it's just that nice kind of feel and vintage look, very classic.
How do you find your vintage paper? I've started going to like Goodwills and thrift stores and picking up older paper, but I know that's something a lot of typewriter collectors love to do, is they love to also use vintage papers. How do you even start to look for or source something like that?
So the most success I've had is typically going to estate sales, and I head directly to the desk. Wherever the desk is, you can, find scissors and paper. And, Chicago is a very kind of working class, I would say working class, blue collar city. And a lot of people even way back, had their own businesses in their homes. And so I've gone to estate sales and bought reams and reams of letterhead, and then also reams and reams of onion skin paper, vintage. So you can really, yeah, if you take the time, you can find some really good stuff.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about paper in general that might be good for someone who's not necessarily looking to do something as far as letterpressing, but who's interested in paper and wants to buy different types of paper?
You can start simply by going on Etsy and maybe finding people who deal with scrap packs, even where you get samples of different odds and ends, and just kind of not being afraid to explore. My first greeting card that I started making and selling was me with my little Erica typewriter, and using this really nice Italian cotton paper that was crazy expensive, but just typing famous quotes on them and then selling those. And it was just so fun to play. And it came in different colors. So, you could try red ink on yellow paper and see what it looks like. So I would just suggest maybe playing. And I don't know about, where everyone is, but we have letter writing meetups here once a month. And I have 8 typewriters that I share with the public, and they can come in and use our typewriters and either purchase products on the wall or bring in their own stuff. And it's fun because you see the same people again and again, but they'll switch typewriters. They like to typewriter hop and test out what works for them, what doesn't. And, before they purchase their own, it's fun to try others.
As Amber said, all of these materials can really impact how ink is accepted into the paper in your typewriter, and it can impact the types of papers that you might want to use for your projects. Hello? I'm working here. The other thing that can impact the typewriter paper or the paper you're using in your typewriter is size. Now, there are 9-ish variations of traditional sized papers, going from A0 to A8. The largest of these is A0, and as you go up a number, you go down in size. So A0 paper is something you would typically use for banners or larger printing jobs, and the sizes here can vary from 118.9 centimeters by 84.1 centimeters, which is 47 by 33 inches. Way too big for your typewriter. And the smallest standardized size of paper you can get is actually for a business card. That would be A8 paper, and that measures 7.4 centimeters by 5.2 or 3 by 2 inches. And yes, I needed notes for all of this. I can't remember numbers. The 2 main sizes of paper that you would typically use in a typewriter are your A4 style paper, which is about 29 centimeters by 21 or 11.5 by 8 in inches. The other size of paper here you might commonly see for typewriters is A5 size paper, and this is about 21 centimeters by 14.5 or 8 by 6 in inches. You can also get A6 size paper, which is postcard size. I have worked with postcards in typewriters before, and that does work as well. These are about 14.8 centimeters by 10.5 or a 6 by 4. So those are the kind of common sizes that you might use in your typewriter, and if you're unfamiliar with what those sizes mean, you can actually look up the different centimeter and inch measurements for those paper types. I've included some links below where I got my information. So if you're searching for paper and you see these A numerical designations, that's referring to the size of the paper, which is kind of a standardized system depending on the paper manufacturers. Now they do make even smaller and smaller paper types, and you can get them into your typewriters with a little bit of finagling. That A8 size, for example, is business cards. If you don't roll them through and just stick them in through the front or have a card holder, you can use those. And I have used Post-its before on a typewriter. The nice thing about them is they have a sticky back, so you can stick them to the platen and roll them through. The difficulty you have here is the smaller sizes in paper make it a little bit more difficult to actually get your paper guides to work. When you have little plastic ones here in the front, they seem to hold down things pretty well, but if you have one that is a metal bar that goes down over your platen, it can be kind of difficult to get smaller and smaller papers to rest perfectly against your platen so that you can type and get a good impression. Now, the other consideration here is actually the width of your carriage for how wide a piece of paper it can accept. Typical paper in the A4 and 5 range does fit into your typewriter pretty easily, but carriage lengths can vary and they can accept different types of paper depending on which style of machine you have. So I went through and checked all of my portables. Most of my portables were measuring under 10 inches across the platen, so your entire carriage doesn't accept paper, only the rubber parts do. So I measured that, and on my portables you can accept about 10 inches worth of paper. If you are working on a desk standard, those are measuring a little over 10, almost 12 inches, depending on the model. They do make wide carriage machines as well, and those can be up to 17 inches or even further. So those could be used for more specific jobs like accounting or lawyer offices if you have to work with very wide sheets of paper. Now, you can't always get inch marks across the back of your portable machine, but you might notice there is a ruler across the back of your typewriter, or maybe across the front on some rails. Now, these are actually used to show how many characters per inch you can get across your typewriter. So if you're looking at a typewriter and it's got a bunch of ticks across the back, and it's anywhere from 80 to 90 ticks across the back, you might be looking at a pica style machine, which is a machine that has characters per inch of 10, so a pica size type font. If your machine is closer to 100 ticks across the back, you might be looking at an elite style machine, which is 12 characters per inch. So there they're measuring the size of the typeface and how many individual letters you can get in an inch of space. So this can also help you determine the width of your carriage depending on how many ticks you have across the back. The only place where I really run into trouble is on envelopes. Typical A4 and 5 style paper fits into my typewriters pretty easily, but when I get into envelopes, those can be a little bit wider, and I do have to be careful about which machine I choose to use those, because the envelope might be wider than my carriage depending on the portable that I'm using at the time. Now, I typically have been using printer paper in quite a bit of my machines. I don't usually mess around with fancy stationery unless it's a card or a postcard, but I did want to ask Amber, the paper expert, what type of paper she likes to use most in her typewriters.
Do you have a favorite paper to use in your typewriters, like a preference for when you're using your typewriters?
So I use vintage paper, and I will use, there's a, let's see, it's a Strathmore text weight that has a little bit of, I think it's 25% cotton resume paper. And I stumbled upon it at a garage sale and bought it. And then I started doing deep dives on the internet to find the exact label, because it's really wonderful.
Now, Amber mentioned that she likes to use vintage paper, which could be stationery or old letterhead. And if you've ever looked at old versions of typewriter paper, it's very thin, almost like onion skin or vellum paper. You can see kind of right through it, and this does pose some problems for using in a traditional typewriter. So on a typewriter, the rubber piece that rolls your paper through is called your platen. Over time, a platen can harden because rubber does harden over time, and this can make the typing experience really difficult for users. It might make it so that your platen isn't very bouncy, and when a type slug goes to a piece of paper, there's nothing soft to kind of take in some of the pressure of that type slug going into the paper. So when you're using something like a thinner piece of paper, you might want to use a backing sheet. Now, a backing sheet can be anything from a second sheet of paper or even a harder piece of cardstock, and in some cases they do make rubber backing sheets to use behind your paper. You'll feed these in through your machine at the exact same time you feed your paper, so you just double up and you roll it through, and then you can type on your paper knowing that you've got something a little softer in the back to cushion the blow of those type slugs against your platen. This is really helpful if you have a hardened platen that's kind of shrunk down a little bit and it's not super tight when you are rolling paper through. It's also really great for thin paper. If you've ever read something where it seems like letters are punched out of the paper itself, it's because those type slugs are going all the way through the paper, and eventually they do hit the platen, which can cause damage to your platen over time. So using a backing sheet is another common practice to help when you're using thinner papers or have a hardened platen, just to make the typing experience a little bit more smooth and make those impressions look much nicer on your piece of paper. In addition to talking to an expert, I also wanted to try out some of your suggestions for the best types of paper to use in your typewriters, so here's some of the results of my experimenting. I had a few recommendations from subscribers on which types of paper they preferred, so I decided to try a few. I did try a few things with each of these paper types, including examining the texture or the tooth, seeing the opacity, and feeling the general weight of each paper sheet. I then also did a type test with each type of paper. This first one is 100% cotton paper, which has a nice weight to it and a slight texture, but mostly it feels like a weightier printer paper. It does have some opacity here, which is really nice, and it seems to work well rolling through the machine. Someone also suggested mulberry paper, which I did find, and I will say this one was different. This paper is much more like a fly sheet paper that Amber mentioned, and it's very translucent and thin. The texture of the sheet was also uneven, with different fibers being more visible than others. This was very difficult to roll through the typewriter, and in hindsight, I definitely should have used a backing sheet because of how thin this was. It did crinkle around the edges of my platen, which made it difficult to use. I do love the look of this once it's typed, but maybe not the best texture or weight for continued use. There were two Southworth brand suggestions, Techweave and Linen. Techweave has a very strong texture to it. It's very geometric looking and heavy. It's also 32-pound paper, which is a little bit heavier than the other ones I've used today. I do love the feel of this paper, but it doesn't always roll through very smoothly because of just how thick the paper is. The linen paper is at 24 pounds, so it has a little bit of a different texture, and it's also a little bit finer and lighter. I really preferred this paper over the others as it's a good mix between weight, texture, and feel. As you can see, it's a little bit less opaque, but I think that really helps accept the ink well in the typewriter, and it provides a nice contrast between the ink and the paper itself. So overall, I think this one is probably my pick to use the most frequently in my machines. It's a good balance of everything. And while there are kind of hard and fast rules about a lot of things with typewriters, I find that paper is one of those areas where you can get a little bit more crafty. I've used printer paper. I like writing on index cards on typewriters. I think it's kind of a really cool way to catalog information. I've used Post-its. I have struggled to get postcards into typewriters, but it's been done. So I think paper is a really great way to kind of hone your craft as a typewriter user and get really creative with what you decide to use in your machine. If you're more interested in all of the research I've been doing into paper, I have linked below all the resources that I used in doing this video, and I've also linked below Amber's contact information and all of the information from her store, A Favorite Designs. It's a great place in Chicago. She's got lots of local events involving typewriters, so I encourage you guys to check out her shop information in the description below. And I didn't want to leave you empty-handed from this episode. I went ahead and purchased some things from Amber's online shop, and I'm going to do a little giveaway. So I've listed all the instructions below in the description. Please check those out. All you have to do is be subscribed and fill out a Google form with your email and some contact information. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a winner and send them some things from Amber's shop, as well as some different paper types to try out on your typewriter. Now, the last time I did this giveaway, it was limited to US only, but I've decided to open up this giveaway to everybody, so this is an international opportunity for a giveaway as well. So all you have to do is follow the instructions down below. There's no purchase necessary. I'm covering shipping, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you're more interested in entering the giveaway, there's instructions below on how to do that. If you're interested in more typewriter content, I do have the playlist for the 101 series and the 202 series linked below, as well as all the other typewriter content here on this YouTube channel and on my Instagram at just.my.typewriter. And I thank you all so much for watching, and remind you, you're just my type writer. I have been playing around with carbon paper as well, which is a different style of paper. It allows for you to make multiple copies of something that you're typing, and I have found that it is a solution to the Barbie ribbon problem. So hopefully I'll have a video coming out about that soon, but carbon paper is another way that you can use your typewriter to make multiple copies. It's not a traditional type of paper, but I thought I'd mention it in here as well because it can be a really useful tool, especially when you don't have ribbon cartridges for your Barbie typewriter.